Well, everyone, my name is Jorge Torres Almazán. Welcome to today's session. On behalf of the Universidad Pedagógica Nacional, we want to welcome to this session with Mr. Paul Weaver. Our session today is teaching ESL to adults. Before we go into the session, the interview, the questions and answers, let me tell you a little bit about Mr. Paul. Well, his biodata. Paul Weaver is the Director of Global Education at Bluffton University in Ohio. His master's degree is in Latin American history from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and his doctorate is in critical pedagogy from the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. He has worked with and studied language acquisition and intercultural education in a variety of contexts, including ESL and Spanish teaching in the US, language and cultural immersion in Mexico and Guatemala, and international peacemaking work in Colombia. His doctoral dissertation was on the dynamics of nonviolent action among international and indigenous actors in Chiapas. He is an avid language learner, and he is fluent in English and Spanish, speaks Portuguese, and is currently studying Arabic. Teaching English to adult immigrants in the United States has been among the most gratifying work he has done in his life, and it was through this work that he met me. We know each other. Paul has a deep commitment to building intercultural understanding through experiential and language education, and believing that this is part of the building of a world of justice and peace. Everyone, please welcome Paul to Tampico and to TESOL Tampico Talks. Thank you very much, Paul, for being here.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here with all of you today.
Okay. So Paul is so kind to help us understand better how we can teach adult learners better. So we have some questions for Paul, and I'm sure his questions are going to be great for us in what we do as teachers, right? But after the questions we have for Paul, if we have the time, Paul is going to answer any other questions you may have, okay? But before the, let's say, academic questions, let's go to know a little bit about Paul, okay? Paul, what led you to become an ESL teacher?
That's a good question. As you said in the introduction, I've always been interested in languages. And at first, my interest was in learning other languages. And so I studied a variety of languages, including the ones you mentioned, Spanish, Portuguese, and now Arabic. But along the way, I also did some studying of Russian and Latin and German. But it wasn't until, actually the first time I helped someone with English was when I was in high school. Our church sponsored a refugee family from Southeast Asia, from Laos, and they didn't know any English. And a lady from our church said, Paul, would you help tutor them and teach them some English? And that was a very good experience. I realized how hard it is to help someone learn a language. I would learn that also as I tried to learn languages. Later on, after I had some of my own international experience, I was asked to work full-time with refugees in Chicago. And I met some very good language teachers who helped them learn English. And then when it was time when my first daughter was born and I needed a job because we needed a little more income, I got a job at Olive Harvey College in the South Side of Chicago, teaching English as a second language. And I just loved it.
Thank you, Paul. Well, see, that's a little bit on how he started into this. And in those years is when I met Paul back in the 1990 or 91, more or less, more than 30 years ago. Okay. Well, the second question is this one, Paul. Could you tell us it's not exactly a question, but could you tell us about the challenge you faced as an ESL teacher?
I remember the very first time I started teaching in South Chicago, and I had a class that was a very multi-level class. So the challenge was I had some students who knew a lot of English already and other students who knew very little and were just starting out. And my challenge was, how do I teach all of them effectively at the same time very difficult. But I began to work at every class to do things at various levels. So as I learned the level of each student, then I could ask them questions at their level, always seeking not to cause embarrassment, because that leads to repression of their ability to really absorb the language, which Stephen Krashen has referred to, if you're familiar with his work in talking about the monitor and also the affective filter, ways in which when we get uptight or nervous or embarrassed, it's harder for us to learn. So you always want to make the students feel at ease, but also challenge them at the same time. So that's the biggest challenge I faced. And since then, my classes have been more where we try to place people at the right level. But even now, sometimes students get placed at the wrong level, and you still have that challenge. Not every learner is the same. So we always have to differentiate and teach a little bit differently depending on the needs of each student.
And yes, let me tell you, Paul does that, because I remember when I was his student, how much he encouraged me to, to speak and not to be afraid of the language. I remember my classmates into the same thought. We were like, oh, Paul, give us the confidence to speak or to do whatever with the language. That was great. Thank you, Paul. Paul.
Let me just add one thing,
Yes.
Jorge. You remind me of it when I was, so for 3 years, I was teaching in Chicago Heights, which is when I met Jorge. And there were two students that were interesting situation there, a mother and her daughter and daughter-in-law. So an older woman who was maybe in her 50s, and then her daughter-in-law who was in her 20s. And the mother they're both from Mexico. The mother didn't have I think she only had primary education, but she was very friendly, very outgoing, and she could hear the language and pick it up and speak, even though she had trouble. It was reading and writing were harder for her. The daughter-in-law was just the opposite. She had university level education in Mexico, but hadn't been in the United States for as long. And so she didn't speak very much and had trouble understanding, but she could read and write pretty well. And it just brought out to me how each learner is unique. And so as teachers, we need to adapt to the needs of the learners.
Yeah.
Oh, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. I think that's related to the other question we have in here. A story of success. Can you tell us any story of success?
Well, one story of success was a young man who was in my class in 1991 and was very earnest and wanted to learn and worked hard. And then I didn't see him for 30 years until today. And now he's a teacher himself. And not only is he a teacher, but he's an innovative teacher. He thinks of ways to bring in new resource people to give his students exposure to a wide variety of people with different accents and different experiences and different ideas about education. That to me is one example of a success story.
Thank you, Paul. Well, yes, and all of this thanks to you, because Paul was I can say my inspiration to become a teacher. I have talked about him many times to my students and also to colleagues about his classes and about how I started learning English in that time. I was like 22, 23 more or less. And I also remember that Paul insisted in asking me like the question, Jorge, what do you want to do in the future? And I didn't know. And I remember I told Paul, I want to work in a place where I can see people. And then he said, but where? I said, I don't know. But see, later I discovered it was the school as a teacher.
Very good.
Yeah, Paul.
Go ahead.
Yes.
So you are the teacher?
Yes, Paul is my teacher.
And now Jorge's a teacher. So when you work with students and work with other people, you never know what seeds you might be planting. They can grow. You may never find out all the good you do, but when you reach out and listen to your students and try to help them, it will bear good fruit. I want to tell another story about two women that were in my class. And the one woman, they were both from Mexico. One of them was, she was probably in 70 years old. And she was very enthusiastic. She had also very little education growing up, but she was very determined and very cheerful and very persistent, but English was very, very hard for her. And what she needed was someone who had patience. And the success story for me was that she kept studying English for a long time and didn't give up. A second woman who was 92 years old, the oldest woman I've ever taught, who was completely illiterate. She had not gone to school a day in her life. She grew up in a rural, in Rancho, in a poor rural area. And she also wanted to learn. And from her, what I learned is that I love teaching every student. And it doesn't bother me if a student has a hard time learning. That's my job, is to help that student. As long as that student is willing to try, then I am happy.
Thank you, Paul. And I know Paul fulfills of these qualities that we have in the following question, but we want to listen from him. What qualities are important for an ESL teacher to have?
So I just mentioned patience. That's very important. I think you need to like people. You need to be willing to engage with people and connect with them, and support them, but also to know how to challenge them. So an ESL teacher needs to be perceptive. They need to be able to teach to what Vygotsky would call the zone of proximal development, which is that level just above where they are right now. So if they're at this level, how can I teach them and help them move up to this level? Because if I teach them way up here, they won't understand and they'll just be lost. If I teach them way down here, they already know that. I want to go to the next level. And so tuning in to where they're at is important, and not just teaching whatever I planned because that's what I planned it, but sensing, oh, I need to explain that a little bit more, or no, I need to push a little bit harder. I need to go a little farther because they already understand that. And then you need to be able to adapt. You need to have a plan, but then you need to be able to adapt when that's necessary.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, and now let's go to this other question. How is teaching ESL to adults different to teaching children? Because I think there are some differences.
That's a very good question. Very important question. And there's been, lots of research and articles written about the ways in which teaching children and adults are different. And there certainly are some important ways. There's also, but I want to start with talking about how they're the same, because sometimes the differences are exaggerated. Well, I'll use a couple of examples. One thing that we typically think of as different with adults is that they have more experience, and that's true, they do. And when you teach adults, you can draw on their experience of life, and that is a very rich source of material to discuss. You can teach topics that relate to their areas of expertise and interest in the new language. However, in a little bit different way, that's true of children as well. Even though children have much less experience, they still do have some experiences. And when a teacher, an effective teacher, can touch their experience, you can draw that student into your classroom milieu much more effectively. Another thing about teaching adults is with adults, it's even more important to get consent. Here's another area. For example, in my classes, my adults would mean, they often were working full time. They might have had families, they had other commitments. They were deciding to come to a class in their extra time because it was important to them. And so I needed to respect that, and also respect that if they didn't feel like they were learning from me, they might just stop coming. And so I had to keep that in mind and be tuned in to what their expectations were and explain to them why and how I was doing my teaching so that they could understand where we were going. Now, again, that is a little different than children, because children are more of a captive audience, and you might be at a school where they have to be there. But even then, with children, if you don't help to motivate them, they may be in the room in their bodies, but their minds might not be there. And so even with children, you do have to do that. Another reality for adults that I found is that, similar to what I mentioned earlier about the fact that many have jobs and families, I found that sometimes adults would miss class more often than maybe if I was teaching children and I could expect all or most of the children to be there every day. And I needed to understand that, and I wanted my adult students to be there every day. I want my adult students to come every day, but sometimes they have life experiences. We have an expression, we say life happens. And I, as a teacher, I need to understand that they're doing their best. And so I have to adapt to that and be adaptable and not just be frustrated. So I adapt. So those are some of the ways that, for me, that teaching adults is different. But I think the most important thing is, Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian educator, teaches us that we need to use generative themes and use the themes that are important in people's daily lives. And that's an especially important tool for adults to help them, give them some language they can use today and tomorrow to keep them going, coming back to class.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, now the following question is related to mainly to the accent, the pronunciation, because now people say that pronunciation is not an issue anymore, but we are concerned, we worried, we think about this, the critical period hypothesis. So is there a way we adults can overcome this?
That's a great question. This is one of my favorite questions. So I think there is, the critical period does exist, but I think we give it too much power. So there is somewhat of a difference in the way most children learn language, both pronunciation and grammar and word usage, compared to adults. But I think that it becomes an excuse sometimes. So I'm 62 years old. A few months ago, I started to learn a new language, Arabic. It's quite hard for me. I'm not in my critical period anymore. But I do believe that I can still learn it. And I believe that I can hear the sounds and I can absorb it and I can use it. It might take a long time. It might take me longer than it would if I was a child. But I have some things that children don't have. Adults have some real resources that are powerful that help them as learners. So adults have the capacity to analyze at a deeper level than children do, to draw connections and understand more quickly certain concepts than children might. Adults have the opportunity or the power sometimes to make changes in their life, to make space for the learning that they want to occur, depending on their life circumstances. But also, I do believe that adults can learn well a language with a modified version of the way children learn a language. When I tell my students often that I ask them, how did you learn your first language? So if they're Spanish speakers, how did you learn Spanish? Well, they don't really remember learning Spanish. They just always spoke it because their mothers talked to them. But they had an opportunity to listen for a couple years, like 2 years, they could listen all day long to the new language, and no one was trying to force them to speak correctly or to take a test or anything else. They just let that language flow into them, and then pretty soon it started coming out. So I try to use a modified version of that, where we try to speed up the process a little bit and give some structure, because adults do like a little bit of structure and understand a little bit about what they're learning, but not too much emphasis on grammar, but more emphasis on communication and on hearing the sounds. And you have to hear the sounds a lot. I remember when my son was growing up, and he was very little, and his first word was ball, because he loved balls, and he would say ball, 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 maybe 100 times every day. Well, as an adult, I'm more self-conscious than a 2-year-old. So I am embarrassed if I say pelota 100 times in one day, but that's what, if I can get myself to do that, if I can become like a child and I can say that, I will learn better. I need to, the part of the being an adult that's a challenge is something you can control, and that's your inhibition, your fear, your reserve, your fear of being embarrassed. If you can overcome that and just say, here I am, world, I'm going to embrace this language, and don't worry if every single word is perfect. What you want to do is, the purpose of language is to help you connect with other people. And any way you do that, that's fantastic and that's good. And you can keep working on, you can learn about the grammar, the correct pronunciation, the correct spelling, the correct word usage, but that's not the most important thing. Those things are helpful and they have their place, but they are useless if you're not communicating. You actually want to reach out and connect with another human being. That's the power of it. And that's why I believe that language learning can be a powerful tool for peacemaking and building better human relationships.
Thank you, Paul. I remember when Paul invited me to go to a protest, a march in Chicago when there was a war in Iraq. There was the invasion to Iraq. And Paul is always fighting for peace, right? I mean, he went there in a peaceful way, not vandalizing anything, right? I remember you invited me to go to that march or protest. I didn't accept your invitation, Paul, that time. I was very young. I was afraid. I didn't know what to do. I've never been in a protest like that, not in my country. And well, I was in a country which was not mine, so I decided not to go. But I remember you always advocate for peace.
I'm glad that you remember that. I had forgotten that, so it's good to remember. Yes.
Well, let's go to the other block of questions we have in here, everyone. Let's go to it right here.
Teacher, I want to ask to the teacher, Mr. Paul.
Yeah.
Okay, in my case, in my group, there are students, teenagers and young adults, and I think some of them are in problems when they want to learn the pronunciation. Some of them, not all of them. And I ask, well, I usually tell them, the more you practice, the more you learn, but you have to do that, because if you don't do that, you aren't going to learn to pronounce the correct word.
That's
so
right.
I don't know, but it's difficult, a little bit difficult, because the group is not for children and it's not for teenagers, and it is not for young adults. It is mixed. Yes. So
well, your question goes right with Jorge's next question about how to help learners improve their pronunciation. So I'll go ahead and address that.
okay.
So I think I used to think that pronunciation had mostly to do with the way you have your mouth and your throat and your vocal cords, and that's part of it. But the more important part is right here, is your ear.
Yeah, listening.
being able to hear the sounds. And sometimes we don't hear clearly the sounds of the other language because they're sounds we're not used to. And so the more we can hear them, and Jorge, do you remember using jazz chants? Did I ever do that with you, the Carolyn Graham jazz chants? I liked that. Another thing is music. Perhaps, Claudia, with your students, that listening to music in English and then singing those songs themselves. I feel like in song, you can have repetition because it's normal to sing a same song over again, or even a song with a verse that's repeated. You can hear it, there's a clear rhythm, and it's easier to get it with the rhythm. A lot of times, we might, a learner learning a new language, an English learner might learn the pronunciation of a specific word, but not pronounce the sentence correctly because the rhythm of the language is different. One time, one of my professors told me that in thinking about Spanish and English, that Spanish is a more staccato language, da, 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 da. And English is more of a syncopated language, like da, 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 da. And so if you can, what music does is you have a phrase that, and certain things are emphasized, they're on the beat, and certain things are not on the beat, and that can help you. One of my first Spanish teachers taught me a song. I was in Honduras, and she taught me this song, a la capotín, tin, 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 que esta noche va a llover. A la capotín, tin, 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 hasta el amanecer. And it's a long song with a bunch of verses, and I still remember all those verses. And at that time, I didn't speak very much Spanish at all. And learning that song gave me the confidence, well, I can learn something. Maybe I can't go and have a conversation yet, but I have this one piece of language that's mine now. And I struggled with the pronunciation. When I was 19, when I learned that song, and I was living with a Honduran family, and there were some children in the street outside of our house, and I sang it to them, and I said, a la capotín, tin, 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 and they started laughing at me. They said, Pablo, ¿por qué estás diciendo a la capochín, chin, chin, chin? And I said, no. And they explained to me, and I learned about, I didn't know the term for it, but I learned that in Spanish, you don't aspirate your T's, but in English, you do. I know that now. I show my students, the way I show my students the T in English and Spanish is, if I say the number 2 in English, two, I don't know if you can see the paper move, 2, the paper moves. But in English, if I say tú, or in Spanish, tú quieres, it doesn't move because it's an unaspirated word. So if they can see it visually, perhaps that can help them understand the pronunciation. So there's many different ways. Pronunciation is not easy for everyone, but I think anyone can improve their pronunciation. Some people will arrive at a near native pronunciation. Other people might have more of an accent. That's okay. The goal is just to be understood.
Okay.
Thank you, Paul. Yes, I'm going to ask everyone to turn off the microphones while Paul is speaking, because right now, I guess there is 1 or 2 microphones open, but you can participate, all right? I mean, just let him speak and avoid the noises, okay? So check your microphone. If there is a microphone open, please close it right now. Well, Paul, the following question is related to that one. Should we aim for intelligibility?
Yes. And perhaps, Jorge, sometimes the host can go in and mute someone if you want to try to do that. You might have the ability to control that too. So, yes, so that is the pronunciation does matter, because if your pronunciation is so different from what the people that you're talking to can understand, and they can't understand you, then that defeats the purpose of the language. So, so I want to help my students. I usually work a lot on pronunciation with my students, but I try not to do it through correction. I try not to do very much correction or telling my students that's wrong. Instead, I'll listen to the things that I hear that I'm concerned about, and then I will teach a mini lesson modeling the way to say something and asking them to repeat after me, or having them hear two versions of something and see if they can distinguish between it. One of my professors taught me to use pairs of words that are similar, like the word sheep and ship, because for Spanish speakers, that E and the I sound a lot like the Spanish speakers will tend to say sheep, sheep. And it's really, and so I would go like this with my hands, sheep, and then ship, to help them realize one is long and one is short. So, and that might help one person, it might not help another person. So then I try something different. Sometimes I'll put two words on the board. I'll put sheep over here and ship over here, maybe with a picture. And then I say, you just listen now. I'm going to say a word, you point to the one that I'm saying. And so I say the word and they point to it. Then I'll say, okay, close your eyes, so they can't look at what the other students are doing. Close your eyes and point to it. And we try to have, hopefully we have fun with it and make the learning of those things a fun thing and not something that they feel bad about, that they're struggling with it.
Well, that's related to the other question, right? That the techniques, well, in this case, classroom management techniques, but in this case, for handling groups of students that speak different languages. Maybe not here in Mexico, but for example, in the US, at the college, I remember there were students from different backgrounds and different languages. So what would be like the techniques we can implement in a classroom? Because this is going to be seen by people from other countries, but not only from Mexico.
Yes, I do think that while it may seem like a challenge to have people that speak different languages, in some ways it's an opportunity. It helps you to stay in the target language. I'm a firm believer that if you're teaching English at any level, even at a beginning level, that 90% of your time should be in the target language. That means if you teach a 50-minute class, if you teach a class for 50 minutes, for 45 minutes, you need to be entirely in English. And you may occasionally use one or two words of Spanish or of the home language of the people, your students, but you always need to bring it immediately back into English. But your English also needs to be intelligible. You need to learn how to speak the target language in a way that your students will understand, which is very challenging in a beginning level class, but you can do it. It can be done. If you have students that speak different languages, it makes it essential. You don't have a choice. You don't have a choice but to speak the target language. That actually improves, it can improve if you're able to speak the language at a level that your students can understand, and that's at the zone of proximal development. So not only do you want to speak the target language 90% of the time, you should also speak in such a way that your students understand 90% of what you say. When they get below 90%, if they understand 7 words out of every 10 words, they might not understand the whole sentence and they might be totally lost. But if they can understand 90%, they might be a little lost here and there, but they're going to follow the conversation, follow the discussion, follow the lesson. And you always want a few new words in there because that's how we acquire new languages, by hearing it in context. And so that is good. If I have students who speak different languages, and I do a lot of small group work or pair work where students will talk with a partner, sometimes briefly, sometimes longer. Pair 2 people up who don't speak the same language, then they have to speak in English. That's the only option they have. And then they'll try to communicate. I want to tell one story about a student that taught me an important lesson. When I taught at the South Chicago Learning Center, the overwhelming majority of my students were Spanish speaking, students from Mexico, Central America, and Puerto Rico, a few other places. But I would have 1 or 2 students in the class out of 30 students, maybe 1 or 2 students who spoke like they came from Haiti, spoke French or Creole, sometimes from Eastern Europe. I had one woman who was from Croatia in Eastern Europe, and everyone else in the class spoke Spanish. This was an intensive class where I gave a class for 4 hours every day, 4 days a week. They had 30 minutes of a break in the middle. And in the break, they'd go to the break room and have their lunch, and they'd talk to each other in their own language, which was Spanish. So this student went through my class and then went up to the next level. And about a month later, I asked her, I said, well, how is your English coming? And she said, well, it's a struggle, but I'm coming little by little, but my Spanish is great. Why? Because she spent 3.5 hours every day studying English with her teacher. For 30 minutes every day, she sat in the break room, eating lunch and listening to her friends speak Spanish. She learned more during that 30 minutes of informal conversational interaction than she did in 3.5 hours with me or the other teacher. What did that tell me? It told me authentic communication is the key to learning, especially for that student who was very social. She loved having friendships and she wanted to communicate with people, and there were other young people her age. And so she forced herself to understand, and she learned Spanish just as much as she learned English.
Thank you, Paul. Well, I'm sorry about this other question because you already answered that question. I guess I was really excited about having my teacher here, and I made this mistake.
That's okay.
Let's go to the other question. See, now that, I mean, during the pandemic, we have been forced in a way to use technology a lot. And some of us struggle with this because many of us are digital immigrants. And it's not the same for us when we are face-to-face than when we are teaching or learning through online, for example. So what's the role of technology in adult ESL instruction, Paul? What do you think?
So I am a strong believer that the three most important things in learning and teaching and learning is the teacher, the teacher, the teacher. Those are the three things. So I want to first say, we as teachers make the biggest difference. We can, for good or for bad, depending on our attitude and our approach and the care in which we approach our students. Technology can be a tool like any other tool, and it can help, but it can't make up for someone who doesn't care about their students or hasn't taken time to learn the best ways to help their students learn. So given that technology is not always essential, there are some uses of technology which I've come to appreciate. During the past 2 years, I've had to teach more and more via Zoom because of the COVID epidemic. And one of the things I've learned that is helpful in Zoom is the breakout room. So I can, if I have a group of 30 students, and when we're all together, it's hard for all the students to practice speaking as much as I would like them to. But I could break up into 15 breakout rooms of 2 each, give them very clear instructions ahead of time, what I would like them to do, what I'd like them to talk about. I can even broadcast through Zoom. I can send them messages, even give them some language you could use to ask depending on their level, and partially structure a conversation for them, but then let them transform the language a little bit to ask it in a different way, to practice. And so that's something you can do with technology. You can do that in a classroom in small groups, clearly, but on Zoom, I can press a button and divide up into 15 groups, and then I can drop in on different groups and listen to them and make a comment or two, and then go to the next group. So that's kind of nice. It's not essential, but it does help. In this situation, we can still learn. So it's a gift during time of COVID to be able to learn this way. And one thing that I used a lot recently, I currently teach some Spanish classes as well here at Bluffton to my university students. And I often use clips of movies or films or sometimes news reports or television advertisements with my students. And one of the things that I can do with technology is I can slow it down. So I like to set it on 0.75. So three quarters time. So it's a little bit slower and my students can understand better. And then I go back and speed it up again to full speed. And we can listen to the same thing over and over again, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times. And that helps. I mean, you can do that also by speaking, but with the technology, I can bring other people's voices into my classroom, and they can hear many different voices. I could hear someone from Argentina and someone from Spain and someone, so if you were teaching English, you could have a voice from England and a voice from Australia and a voice from the United States to hear different ways of saying something. So that's another use of technology. I think also sometimes you can have students record their own voices and either listen back or share it with each other. And they can hear themselves in a different way than they can when they're speaking. And maybe they can notice, oh, I didn't realize I was saying it like that. And this person's saying it like this. So maybe they can become more reflective through using the technology. So those are a few examples of how I would use technology, even though by far the most important thing is your relationship with your student, you as a teacher, what you give the student, that's the most important thing. So even without technology, when two people come together, there can be teaching and learning.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Well, these are the questions we had for this session, but now we are going to open for the audience. Whoever wants to ask a question or comment on something, this is the time, everyone. Please go ahead if you have a question or a comment on this topic.
And feel free, you can either unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can type it in the chat if you would rather ask that way. That's fine too.
But yes, that's another one. You can use the chat.
Thank you, Mr. Weaver. Your dissertation was excellent. Since the topic was mainly focused on speaking, I'm actually working on a project based on writing skills.
Okay.
Can you share with us a tip to promote writing skills with students?
Yes.
Thank you.
I believe that one of the most important ways to learn to write well is to read a lot. And so if a student has not yet read very much in the target language, so if it's an English student, they don't read very much in English, it's going to be a lot harder for them to write English. So finding some reading material that is at an appropriate level, at their level that they can understand. And sometimes maybe you have to write something yourself or find some things, but there's a number of resources out there now. There's lots of different really good resources that you can find, and have them read something and then have them write in response to what they're reading, or have them paraphrase something they've read. I think those are good ways. And before you have them try to come up with something totally new and put it together, where they may have too many grammatical issues that it makes it hard to work with, because you don't want to have to correct 12 things in one sentence, but maybe there's 12 errors in one sentence. But if you give them a model and let them slightly change that, structure, or if you use a close exercise where you have, the several words and you have a blank in the sentence and they have to fill that in, you give them choices. Those are bridges towards writing, and that can start moving them towards the writing. And eventually, after they've read a fair amount, their writing will start to come more naturally. So is that helpful?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Whoever wants to comment on something, I just saw that we have a teacher from Peru. Lucila, thank you for joining us today. I'm not sure if she can listen to us, but she's here. Well, as I said before, any comments or question, anyone? We still have like a couple minutes before we go.
Yep. I'd love to hear from you. Any question is fine.
Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. Nice meeting you, Paul.
Nice
My
meeting
name
you.
is Blanca. Hi.
Hi.
Everything that you said was interesting.
So tell me, Blanca, what do you do? Are you a teacher?
Excuse me?
Are you a teacher?
Yes, of course, I'm a teacher.
So tell me about where you teach and who your students are.
Well, I work in different schools. I work with university students and high school students. And it's something that we enjoy. If we don't like it, if we don't enjoy teaching, we will not be enjoying
Yes.
the same.
That's
So
right.
it's and these days it's really challenging. It has been really challenged to work in this situation. But either way, we have to enjoy.
Yes. Yes.
Mhm. Yeah.
One of the ways that I try to keep my teaching fresh and alive is by learning myself, to never stop being a learner.
Yeah.
And so the fact that all of you are here today and trying to talk to each other and get new ideas about teaching is a real tribute to your commitment
Sure.
to teaching and to high quality education. So I salute you for that.
Yes. Mhm.
I try, when I'm teaching Spanish, I try to also keep challenging myself, and I try to read new things and always learn more words, and because there's always more I can learn. One of the reasons I study other languages, like I'm studying Arabic, which is very hard because it's a different alphabet and it's different, is because I don't ever want to forget what it's like to start trying to learn a new language when you don't know it. Because sometimes it's easy for me sometimes I find myself getting frustrated with a student and I'll say, well, I explained it 3 times. Why don't you understand? But then if I'm studying, I can realize, oh, I just looked at that 5 times and I still don't understand. So maybe I'll be a little more patient and sympathetic with my students because I remind myself what it was like to try to learn.
Sure. Yes. How can I say, feeling what a student feels,
Yes.
we are able to understand them much better.
Yes.
Well, I want to thank all of you, everyone, for attending this session. And I want to thank Paul for accepting my invitation and for reconnecting, because now I am in contact with my teacher again. That's great for me. Thank you very much, Paul, for this time you spent with us. And I hope this is not the last time you visit Tampico virtually, but you are here with us.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I take my hat off to all of you for your commitment to helping your students learn and to providing a new language for them. A saying that was shared with me at one time is to learn a new language is to know another world, another way of looking at the world. And the work you do in teaching language to your students is opening up new ideas, new opportunities, and new understandings to your students. It's a wonderful and a blessed occupation. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.